The morning sun slanted through the windows of Elite Martial Arts Academy, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floors. The place smelled of disinfectant and sweat, that familiar mixture that hung in the air of all serious training facilities. Tuesday morning classes were usually quieter, attended mostly by dedicated regulars who could make the 10 a.m. slot between work and other responsibilities. Margaret Chen paused at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the door handle. Through the glass, she could see about 15 people inside, most in their 20s and 30s, stretching and chatting in small groups. All wore crisp white or blue jeans with colorful belts wrapped around their waists. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves that came with entering a new place. At 72, she had learned that first impressions mattered more than ever. People saw the silver hair and wrinkles first, making assumptions before she even opened her mouth. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The cool air-conditioned breeze hit her face, a welcome relief from the early autumn heat outside. A few heads turned, conversations briefly pausing as curious eyes assessed the newcomer. Margaret straightened her shoulders slightly but kept her expression neutral. Her weathered hands clutched a simple black gym bag. Nothing fancy, just practical. At the front desk, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard looked up from his computer screen. His eyebrows rose slightly, just enough that Margaret noticed. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'd like to try a class today." The receptionist, his name tag read Kevin, and smiled professionally. "Of course. Is this your first time practicing jiu-jitsu?" There it was, the assumption. Margaret had faced it countless times before. "Not exactly," she replied simply, not elaborating. "Do I need to fill out any paperwork?" Kevin slid a clipboard across the desk. "Just this waiver form, and we'll need to know about any medical conditions that might affect your training." As Margaret filled out the form, she felt the weight of stares from across the room. Two young men near the water cooler were whispering, one nudging the other with an elbow while glancing in her direction. She pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the form in front of her. Near the far wall, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a black belt was demonstrating a technique to a small group. Coach Williams, she presumed, based on the website she'd researched. He moved with the confident grace of someone who had spent decades on the mat. Margaret watched his technique from the corner of her eye while signing her name at the bottom of the form. "Here you go," she said, sliding the clipboard back to Kevin. "Great. The beginner's class starts at noon if you'd like to come back then. It's perfect for—" "Actually," Margaret interrupted gently, "I'd like to join the advanced class that's starting now." Kevin's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, well, the advanced class is really for students who have significant experience. Coach Williams typically requires at least a blue belt level of proficiency." Margaret placed her membership fee, cash, on the counter. "I understand. I'll take full responsibility if I can't keep up." A moment of uncomfortable silence passed as Kevin seemed to weigh his options. "Let me check with Coach," he finally said, rising from his chair. Margaret nodded and moved to a bench near the wall, setting her gym bag down. She unzipped it and pulled out a plain black rash guard and simple gray workout pants. No fancy logos or bright colors like many of the younger students wore. Her attire was practical, well-worn but clean. As she untied her sneakers, she overheard fragments of conversations. "Must be lost. Think she knows what class this is, probably looking for water aerobics at the—" Margaret had heard it all before. She changed her shoes for soft mat shoes and began gentle stretches, focusing on her breathing rather than the whispers. Kevin returned with Coach Williams, who approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was younger than Margaret had expected from his photos online, probably in his early 40s, with the compact, powerful build of someone who had dedicated his life to martial arts. "Good morning," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Dan Williams. Kevin tells me you're interested in joining our advanced class." Margaret shook his hand firmly. "Margaret Chen." "Yes, that's right." His handshake was carefully modulated, not the bone-crushing grip he could have used, but not entirely natural either. Another small sign of the assumptions being made. "This class focuses on complex techniques and can be quite physically demanding," Coach Williams explained. "We do have excellent beginner and intermediate options that might be more appropriate for—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "For someone my age?" Margaret finished for him, her tone neutral. A flash of discomfort crossed the coach's face. I was going to say, for new students. Safety is my primary concern for all my students. Margaret nodded. I appreciate your concern. Perhaps you'll allow me to participate in today's warm-up. And if you feel I'm not able to keep up safely, I'll gladly switch to the beginner class. Coach Williams considered this, then nodded. That sounds reasonable. Have you brought a GE? No, just these. Margaret gestured to her simple workout clothes. I wasn't sure about the dress code for visitors. That's fine for today. The changing rooms are through there. He pointed toward a hallway. We start in 5 minutes. As Margaret collected her bag and headed toward the changing room, she heard a young woman near the water fountain whisper to her friend. $10 says she doesn't make it through the warm-up. The changing room was empty when Margaret entered. She took a moment alone to center herself, breathing deeply as she changed into her workout clothes. The mirror reflected a woman with short silver hair framing a face lined by 7 decades of life. Her body was thin but wiry, maintaining a straight posture that many her age had long abandoned. Only the faint scars on her knuckles and the calluses on her palms hinted at her history. When she returned to the main training area, the class had begun to assemble on the mats. Coach Williams was at the front, with about 15 students arranged in rows facing him. Margaret noticed the careful spacing, how each person automatically stood according to some invisible hierarchy, likely based on belt rank. She placed herself at the back corner, giving herself space. A few students glanced back, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. A muscular young man with a purple belt leaned toward his partner and whispered something that made them both snicker. Coach Williams cleared his throat. Let's begin with our standard warm-up. 20 jumping jacks, 20 squats, 20 push-ups. Then we'll move to shrimping and forward rolls across the mat. Partner up for the next section. The class began to move in unison. Margaret matched their pace without hesitation, her movements precise if not as explosive as the younger practitioners. Her jumping jacks were methodical, each squat executed with proper form. For the push-ups, she didn't drop to her knees as some might have expected, instead performing each one with textbook technique. As they moved to the mat work, Margaret noticed Coach Williams watching her from the corner of his eye. She executed her shrimps, the fundamental hip escape movement, with the smooth efficiency that came from thousands of repetitions over many years. Her forward rolls were tight and controlled, rising back to her feet without using her hands for support. When it came time to partner up, a telling moment of awkwardness spread through the room. Students who normally worked together automatically paired off, carefully avoiding eye contact with Margaret. Coach Williams noticed the situation and frowned slightly. Mike, you'll work with our visitor today, he instructed, gesturing to a young assistant instructor with a brown belt. Mike nodded, his expression carefully neutral as he approached Margaret. Hi there. We'll take it nice and slow, okay? There was that tone again, the one reserved for children and the elderly. Margaret simply nodded. Let's start with some basic grip fighting, Mike suggested, clearly modifying the more advanced drills others were practicing. Just grab my sleeves and I'll show you how to. Would you prefer standard kumikata or competition grips? Margaret asked quietly. Mike blinked, momentarily thrown by the technical terminology. Standard is fine for now. As they began the grip fighting exercise, Mike's initial condescension gradually shifted to confusion. Margaret's hands moved with practiced precision, her grips breaking and establishing with unexpected strength and technique. When he attempted a more advanced grip sequence, she countered it with such smooth efficiency that he found himself slightly off balance. You've done this before, he stated, reassessing her with newfound curiosity. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Once or twice. Across the room, Coach Williams was demonstrating a complex sweep to the class, but his attention kept drifting to Margaret's corner. The older woman was moving with a fluidity that spoke of something beyond basic familiarity. There was an economy to her movements, nothing wasted or exaggerated. As the warm-up section concluded and the class prepared to move into the technical portion, Coach Williams approached Margaret and Mike. How are we doing over here? He asked, his tone more genuine than before. Fine, thank you, Margaret replied simply. Mike nodded, a new respect evident in his expression. She's keeping up no problem, Coach. Coach Williams studied Margaret for a moment. Where did you train before, Mrs. Chen? Miss, she corrected gently. Various places. It's been a while since I've trained in a formal setting. I recently moved to the area to be closer to my grandchildren. Something in her calm demeanor made Coach Williams reconsider his initial assessment. He nodded slowly. Well, welcome to Elite Academy. Let's see how you do with today's techniques. As the class gathered around for the technical demonstration, the whispers and stares continued. But Margaret noticed a subtle shift. The outright dismissal had been replaced by curiosity and confusion. She had passed the first invisible test, but she knew there would be more to come. Margaret took her place among the students, ready for whatever challenges the class would bring. Her journey at Elite Martial Arts Academy had only just begun, and first impressions were important, on both sides. The technical portion of the class began with Coach Williams demonstrating a basic guard pass, followed by a more complex submission sequence. Margaret stood toward the back of the gathered students, her eyes carefully tracking every movement of the coach's hands and feet. Unlike many of the younger students who watched with casual interest or checked their phones when the coach looked away, Margaret's focus was unwavering. Notice how I distribute my weight here, Coach Williams explained, shifting his hips as he pinned his assistant Mike to the mat. This prevents them from recovering guard while I set up the armbar. Margaret nodded slightly to herself, mentally noting the subtle weight distribution technique. It was similar to what she had learned decades ago, though with small modern adaptations that intrigued her. All right, pair up and drill this sequence 5 times each, then switch roles, Coach Williams instructed the class. The familiar awkward shuffle began again as students quickly paired with their usual partners. This time, however, the problem was more pronounced. With 16 students, including Margaret, someone would be left without a partner. Margaret stood quietly, waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself. 2 young men, both wearing blue belts, found themselves the last ones without partners. The taller one, with a sleeve of tattoos running down his left arm, glanced at Margaret and then back to his friend with a grimace. Rock, paper, scissors for who gets stuck with Grandma, he suggested loud enough for nearby students to hear. His friend, a stocky man with a closely shaved head, snickered. No way, man. You lost the bet about her making it through warm-ups. Your punishment is working with the retiree. Coach Williams overheard the exchange and frowned. Tom, Paul, that's enough. Tom, you'll work with Ms. Chen. Paul, you can join Mike and me for a 3-person rotation. Tom's face fell, but he reluctantly approached Margaret, keeping a full arm's length between them. Hey, he said flatly, so you want to start on top or bottom? The phrasing made several nearby students snicker. Tom smirked, clearly pleased with the reaction. Margaret met his gaze calmly. I'll start in the defensive position. Her voice betrayed no emotion. They found an open space on the mat, and Margaret took up her position on her back, establishing a basic closed guard as Tom knelt between her legs, looking uncomfortable and slightly disgusted. He placed his hands on her knees with visible reluctance, as if touching something unpleasant. I'll go slow so you can follow, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Don't worry if you can't remember all the steps. Margaret simply nodded, her face unreadable. Tom began the guard passing sequence, applying pressure to break Margaret's guard. To his surprise, her legs didn't budge easily. He pushed harder, his brow furrowing with confusion and then irritation when her guard remained closed. You need to relax your legs, he instructed, his voice tinged with annoyance. This isn't about strength. Of course, Margaret replied mildly, releasing her guard smoothly. Tom proceeded with the technique, but each step seemed to require more effort than he expected. When he attempted to pin Margaret's shoulders to establish side control, he found her frame mysteriously difficult to break down. Not impossibly so, she wasn't stopping him completely, but enough that his technique had to be precise. Is this correct? Margaret asked innocently when he finally established the position. Tom's face had reddened with the unexpected exertion. Yeah, that's fine, he muttered. Across the room, Coach Williams was watching the exchanges with growing interest while simultaneously instructing Paul and Mike. The older woman's movements were deliberate and efficient, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be years of proper training. As the drilling continued, Tom's frustration mounted. When it was Margaret's turn to perform the technique, she moved with such fluid precision that Tom found himself pinned before he fully registered what had happened. Her movements lacked the explosive power of the younger practitioners, but there was an unsettling efficiency to them. How did you? He began. then stopped himself. Lucky attempt, he muttered. Perhaps, Margaret replied. Shall we try again? By the third repetition, a small audience had begun to form. Several nearby pairs had slowed their own practice to watch the unusual duo. Tom noticed the attention and his embarrassment turned to anger. Look, just because you did some yoga or watched UFC doesn't mean you understand real jiu-jitsu, he said under his breath as they reset. This isn't a senior center activity. Margaret didn't respond, simply waiting in position for the next repetition. From the other side of the room, two students, a woman with a purple belt and her partner, were whispering while looking in Margaret's direction. Where did she come from? The woman asked. Her partner shrugged. Probably saw it on TV and thought it looked easy. She'll quit after today when she realizes how tough it actually is. I don't know, the woman replied thoughtfully. She moves like someone who's trained before. At her age? Come on, Lisa, she's got to be at least 70. My point exactly. If she's been training since she was young, she might have decades of experience. Whatever. Tom looks like he's about to lose it. Indeed, Tom's face had grown increasingly flushed as Margaret executed the technique flawlessly for the fourth time. When they stood to switch positions again, he deliberately bumped against her shoulder as they moved. Sorry, he said, not sounding sorry at all. Coach Williams called out from across the room. 5 more minutes on this drill, then we'll move on. As the class continued, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense around Margaret and Tom. Other students had begun to take notice of the unusual dynamic, with some watching with amusement and others with growing curiosity. Tom's friend Paul made a point of laughing loudly whenever he glanced in their direction. Hey Tom, Paul called out during a brief pause. How's retirement home jiu-jitsu going? Learning lots of new techniques? Several students laughed, though a few looked uncomfortable with the obvious mockery. Coach Williams frowned. Paul, focus on your own drilling, but the damage was done. The comment seemed to give permission for others to join in. As the class moved on to the next technique, AE, sweep from butterfly guard, the whispers and jokes became more frequent and less subtle. Maybe we should add prune, juice to the water fountain, someone suggested from across the room. Do you think she brought her life alert button to class? Another replied. Margaret continued her practice, her face betraying nothing. If anything, her movements became more precise, her techniques cleaner as the ridicule increased. Tom, sensing the social approval of his peers, grew bolder in his disrespect. You know, he said, loud enough for nearby students to hear, my grandmother knits. Maybe that would be a better hobby for you. Margaret looked at him directly for the first time. I find this helps with my arthritis, she said simply. The comment, intended to disarm him, only provided more ammunition. Oh man, she admitted it. Tom laughed, looking around to make sure others had heard. We're basically providing physical therapy here. Coach Williams approached their section of the mat, his expression stern. Everything going okay over here? Fine, Coach, Tom replied quickly. Just making our guest feel welcome. Ms. Chen? Coach Williams asked, turning to Margaret. No problems, she replied calmly. Tom has been very instructive. There was something in her tone, a subtle edge that made Coach Williams look at her more carefully. After a moment, he nodded and moved on, but kept glancing back in their direction. As the class progressed to sparring preparation, Coach Williams addressed the group. We'll finish today with some light rolling. Remember, the goal is technique, not strength or speed. Tap early, tap often. An excited murmur ran through the class. This was clearly the part many of them looked forward to most. Ms. Chen, Coach Williams said, approaching her directly. Sparring can be quite intense. There's no shame in sitting this portion out for your first class. The implication was clear. He didn't think she could handle it. Several students smirked behind his back. I appreciate your concern, Margaret replied, but I'd like to participate if that's acceptable. Coach Williams hesitated, then nodded. Mike will be your sparring partner then. Mike, he called to his assistant, light technical rolling only. Mike nodded, understanding the implicit instruction to take it extremely easy on the elderly visitor. As the pairs spread out across the mat, Tom and Paul found a spot near Margaret and Mike. Watch this, Tom whispered loudly to his friend. She's about to get a reality check. Mike knelt across from Margaret, smiling encouragingly. We'll go very slow, okay? Just relax and try to remember the techniques from class. If anything hurts or feels uncomfortable, just tap my arm or the mat. Margaret nodded, settling into a seated position across from him. Ready? Mike asked. Ready? Margaret confirmed. They clasped hands to begin the roll. Mike applied minimal pressure, clearly holding back to an almost comical degree. Margaret responded by smoothly manipulating his grip and executing a textbook sleeve drag that caught Mike completely off guard. Within seconds, she had taken his back and established a seatbelt grip. Mike's eyes widened in surprise. Nearby, several conversations stopped mid-sentence as students turned to watch. Good move, Mike said, genuinely impressed but still assuming it was beginner's luck. Let's reset and go again. The second exchange began similarly, with Mike being overly cautious. This time, however, Margaret executed a different technique, a perfectly timed sweep that rolled Mike to his back with surprising efficiency. As she established side control, her movements fluid and practiced, a hush fell over the nearby area of the mat. Tom and Paul had stopped their own sparring to stare openly. Coach Williams, from across the room, noticed the unusual stillness in that corner and began walking over. Where did you say you trained before? Mike asked as they reset for a third time, his voice now carrying genuine respect. I didn't, Margaret replied simply. This time Mike engaged more seriously, applying actual technique rather than just going through the motions. Margaret responded in kind, her movements displaying a depth of knowledge that contradicted every assumption that had been made about her. She didn't rely on strength or athleticism, but rather on impeccable timing and leverage, the true essence of Jiu-Jitsu. By now, almost half the class had stopped to watch. Coach Williams stood at the edge of their mat space, his arms crossed and his expression thoughtful. That's not beginner's luck, someone whispered. Who is this lady? Another asked. Tom and Paul exchanged uncomfortable glances as the realization slowly dawned that their mockery might have been severely misplaced. As the timer sounded to end the sparring session, Mike sat up and bowed respectfully to Margaret, a gesture typically reserved for advanced practitioners. Thank you for the roll, he said sincerely. Margaret returned the bow. Thank you for being a good partner. As the class gathered for closing remarks, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The snickers and whispers continued, but their nature had changed from mockery to speculation. Margaret stood quietly at the back, her breathing controlled, and even despite the exertion of the class, Coach Williams addressed the group. Good work today, everyone. Remember, Jiu-Jitsu is about technique and efficiency, not just strength and youth. His eyes briefly met Margaret's as he said this. She gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Class dismissed. See you all tomorrow. As students began to disperse, many cast curious glances toward Margaret. The ridiculing comments had ceased, replaced by questions no one quite dared to ask yet. Margaret collected her water bottle and towel, preparing to head to the changing room. The first class had concluded, but her journey at Elite Martial Arts Academy was just beginning. The real test was still to come. After class, Margaret walked slowly to her car, a modest blue Honda that had seen better days. She placed her gym bag carefully in the trunk, wincing slightly as she straightened up. Despite her impressive performance, 72 years of living had left their mark on her body. She wasn't immune to the aches that followed physical exertion. As she slid into the driver's seat, she noticed Coach Williams exiting the building. Their eyes met briefly before she started her car and pulled away from the parking lot. The look on his face had been one of curious assessment, the kind of look she had seen countless times throughout her life, whenever someone realized there was more to her than met the eye. 20 minutes later, Margaret pulled into the driveway of a small, neatly kept bungalow on the outskirts of town. Wind chimes danced in the autumn breeze, their gentle melody welcoming her home. She had only moved in 3 months ago after selling her old place in San Francisco to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren. Inside, the house was modestly furnished but warm. Photographs lined the hallway, snapshots of a life rich with experiences that none of the people at Elite Academy could have imagined. Margaret set down her keys and headed straight for the shower, letting hot water soothe her muscles while her mind wandered back through the decades. Osaka, Japan, 1972. Margaret had been 19 then, a scholarship student studying international business at Osaka University, young, bright-eyed, and far from her childhood home in San Francisco's Chinatown. It was a different world back then. A young Chinese-American woman alone in Japan was something of an oddity, drawing both curiosity and suspicion. After the shower, wrapped in a comfortable robe, Margaret made herself tea in a worn clay pot that had traveled with her for over 40 years. As the leaves steeped, she walked to a wooden chest in her living room. The antique piece was one of the few luxuries she had allowed herself. She ran her fingers over the carved surface before opening it. Inside, neatly folded, lay a faded black belt, the fabric worn soft with age. Beside it sat several small boxes containing medals, patches, and certificates, physical reminders of a journey that had defined her life in ways she rarely discussed. She lifted out an old photograph, its colors muted with age. In it, a severe-looking Japanese man in his 60s stood beside a much younger Margaret. They were both dressed in traditional judo gis, the man's posture radiating a quiet authority that seemed to fill the frame. Master Takeshi Yamamoto had not smiled for photographs, or much at all, really. But his eyes in this picture held a hint of pride as he stood next to his unlikely student. Margaret smiled at the memory. She hadn't planned to study martial arts when she arrived in Japan. It had been a chance encounter, a purse-snatching attempt on a crowded street that she had instinctively fought against, catching the attention of Yamamoto, who happened to be watching from a nearby cafe. Her untrained but determined resistance had intrigued him. "You fight with spirit but no knowledge," he had told her afterwards in careful English. "This is dangerous, like a sword with no handle." He had offered her lessons initially as a way to protect herself in a foreign country. Margaret had accepted out of practical necessity, and perhaps a bit of curiosity. She couldn't have known then how that decision would alter the course of her life. The kettle whistled, pulling Margaret back to the present. She poured the steaming water into a mug and carried it to her small home office. As she settled into her chair, her eyes fell on another photograph on her desk, this one much more recent. It showed her daughter Grace, son-in-law David, and their two children, Lucy and Ben, all smiling in front of a Christmas tree. Grace had been surprised when Margaret announced her intention to move closer after all these years. "Mom, are you sure? You've always been so independent," she had said during their video call. What Grace didn't say, but what Margaret clearly heard in the question, was the implied concern about having an aging parent nearby, the unspoken worry about becoming a caretaker. Margaret understood. She had no intention of becoming a burden, but after decades of living for her work, she wanted whatever time she had left to include the sound of her grandchildren's laughter. Margaret sipped her tea and opened her laptop. A string of new emails awaited her, most from former colleagues and students scattered across the globe. Even in retirement, the network she had built over decades remained active. Old habits died hard. One email caught her attention, from a former student now working with a special operations unit in Eastern Europe. The message was brief but warm, updating her on his recent promotion and ending with, "Your teaching saved my life last month. The wrist lock transition you showed us created just enough space for me to escape. I wish I could tell you the details." "Thank you, Shifu." Margaret smiled at the Chinese honorific teacher, master. Few people in her daily life would believe that this small, elderly Chinese woman had once been addressed this way by some of the most elite military and security operatives in the world. After finishing her tea, Margaret changed into comfortable clothes and made her way to the basement. Unlike the rest of her modestly furnished home, this space had been extensively renovated. Padded flooring covered the concrete with full-length mirrors lining one wall. A heavy punching bag hung in one corner while various training implements, some familiar, others exotic, were organized neatly along another wall. This was her true sanctuary, hidden from casual visitors. Here she maintained the practice that had defined most of her adult life. Margaret stood in the center of the room and began a series of slow, deliberate movements, a warming kata that Master Yamamoto had taught her in those early days. Her body remembered each position perfectly, muscles responding to patterns established through thousands of repetitions over 5 decades. As she moved, her mind drifted back to 1975. Her scholarship had ended, but she had remained in Japan, having progressed to the point where Master Yamamoto had invited her to live and train at his small private dojo. He had no children of his own, and while he never said it directly, his actions made it clear that he saw Margaret as his successor. "Traditional judo is dying," he had told her one evening after training. "People want sport competition medals. They forget that this art was created for real confrontation, for survival." Under his tutelage, Margaret had learned not just competition judo, but the older, more practical applications of the art. Techniques that had been deemed too dangerous for sporting events, methods that focused on street survival rather than scoring points. By 1980, she had earned her black belt and competed internationally, placing in several major tournaments, but competition had never been her primary interest, nor Master Yamamoto's. Margaret's breathing remained steady as she transitioned to more complex movements, her aging body still capable of remarkable precision. The basement was quiet except for the soft sound of her feet on the mat and her measured breathing. In 1982, everything had changed. A former student of Master Yamamoto's, who had gone on to work with Japan's self-defense forces, had approached them with an unusual request. His unit needed specialized close combat training, something beyond the standard military curriculum, something that would work in real-world situations where lives hung in the balance. Master Yamamoto had declined, citing his age, but had suggested Margaret instead. "She understands the heart of these techniques better than anyone else I have taught," he had said. That recommendation had led to her first teaching contract with a military unit. From there, her reputation had grown. Through the 1980s and 90s, Margaret had traveled extensively, providing specialized training to military and security personnel across Asia. Her American passport and fluency in multiple languages made her valuable for international operations, while her unassuming appearance allowed her to work without drawing attention. Few people questioned the presence of a Chinese-American businesswoman, her official cover for most of these years. In a world dominated by men, Margaret had learned to use others' underestimation to her advantage. The same prejudices that had once frustrated her became useful tools in a career where anonymity was an asset. By the early 2000s, she had expanded her teaching to include specialized protective details for high-profile individuals and corporations. Her methods emphasized efficiency over strength, precision over power, principles that proved especially valuable for security personnel who couldn't always match their opponents physically. Margaret completed her kata and moved to the punching bag, throwing a series of precise combinations. Her strikes lacked the raw power of youth, but each landed exactly where intended. She had long ago learned that perfect placement could overcome strength limitations. 5 years ago, at 67, she had finally decided to retire. Her body couldn't sustain the travel schedule anymore, and the constant security concerns had grown wearying. She had trained her replacements, former students who carried on her methods in various organizations around the world. Margaret had expected to settle into a quiet retirement in San Francisco, perhaps occasionally consulting or conducting private seminars. Then came her son-in-law's job transfer, moving her daughter's family across the country. After months of video calls with her grandchildren, Margaret had made her decision. She would start over one last time. Now, as she finished her training session and cooled down with gentle stretches, Margaret reflected on her first day at Elite Academy. She hadn't planned to reveal much of her background. Decades of discretion were hard to overcome. She had simply wanted a place to maintain her practice, perhaps share some mat time with fellow enthusiasts of the art. The ridicule hadn't surprised her. She had faced far worse in her life, but it had disappointed her. Martial arts, properly understood, were about respect and continuous learning. Somewhere along the way, many modern schools had lost that foundation. As Margaret climbed the stairs from her basement dojo, she thought about tomorrow's class. Coach Williams had seemed intrigued by her performance today. The younger students had been less impressed, though their mockery had given way to confusion by the end. She wasn't looking to prove anything or to teach again. Those days were behind her, but neither would she pretend to be less than she was to make others comfortable. She had earned her knowledge through decades of dedicated practice, and at 72 she no longer had the patience for false modesty. Tomorrow would take care of itself. For tonight she would call her grandchildren, make a simple dinner, and go to bed early. The Elite Academy students might be in for some surprises in the coming days, but that wasn't her concern. Margaret Chen had spent a lifetime being underestimated. She was used to it by now. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Elite Academy 15 minutes early. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 2 other cars present. Coach Williams's black SUV and a flashy red sports car she didn't recognize. She took her time gathering her things, moving with the deliberate pace that had become her habit in recent years. No need to rush. Time moved quickly enough on its own. Inside, the academy was quiet. Coach Williams was in his office, visible through the glass window that separated it from the main training area. Across the mat, a young man was going through solo drills in front of the mirror. Margaret recognized him from yesterday. Not Tom or Paul, but another student who had kept to himself during class. He wore a black belt, tied with crisp precision around his waist. The young man noticed her entrance and paused mid-movement, watching as Margaret placed her bag on the bench and began her stretching routine. His expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read, a mixture of curiosity and assessment. Coach Williams emerged from his office, nodding to Margaret. "Good morning, Ms. Chen. Wasn't sure we'd see you back today." "Good morning, Coach," she replied. "I enjoyed yesterday's class." The coach glanced between her and the young man who had resumed his drills with slightly more intensity than before. "That's Jason Reed, one of our newest black belts. Just got promoted last month." Margaret nodded politely but said nothing. She continued her stretches, focusing on her shoulders and hips, the areas that typically needed the most attention these days. "I was impressed by your movement yesterday," Coach Williams said, lowering his voice slightly. "You've obviously had formal training." "Mind if I ask where?" "Japan originally," Margaret answered. "A long time ago." Before the coach could inquire further, the front door opened and more students began to filter in. The morning class was smaller than yesterday's, about 10 people in total. Margaret noticed that Tom and Paul were absent, but several familiar faces from the previous day nodded in her direction, some with genuine respect, others with lingering skepticism. The class began with the usual warm-up routine. This time, no one seemed surprised by Margaret's ability to keep pace. If anything, people were watching her more closely, as if trying to solve a puzzle. She kept her movements precise but unremarkable, neither showing off nor holding back. After warm-ups, Coach Williams gathered everyone for technique instruction. "Today we'll be working on escapes from side control, then transitions to submission. Jason, can you help me demonstrate?" The young black belt stepped forward, his movements radiating confidence. Up close, Margaret could see that he was probably in his late 20s, with the lean, wiry build of someone who trained constantly. His technique during the demonstration was crisp and clean, showing years of dedicated practice. As the students paired off to drill, Margaret found herself working with Lisa, the purple belt woman from yesterday who had defended her to her partner. "I'm Lisa," she said as they found space on the mat. "Your technique yesterday was really impressive. I'd love to learn from you," Margaret smiled. "Thank you. I'm always happy to share what I know." They began working through the escape sequences, with Margaret offering subtle adjustments to Lisa's movements. "Try shifting your hip just a fraction earlier," she suggested. "It creates the space before they can fully settle their weight." Lisa tried the modified technique and found it significantly more effective. "That's amazing. Where did you learn that detail?" "Experience," Margaret replied simply. "When you've been thrown around for enough decades, you find the small efficiencies." Across the mat, Jason had been watching their exchange while half-heartedly working with his own partner. His expression darkened slightly as he observed the purple belt taking instruction from the elderly woman. During a water break, Coach Williams approached Margaret again. "Your understanding of weight distribution is remarkable. Very old school. Reminds me of how some of the Japanese masters teach." Margaret took a small sip from her water bottle. Master Yamamoto was very particular about those details. The coach's eyebrows shot up. "Takeshi Yamamoto? The Olympic coach?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I was fortunate to study with him in the 70s. This exchange didn't go unnoticed. Several students had paused their conversations to listen, including Jason, whose face had taken on an increasingly troubled expression. When training resumed, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. Students were now openly watching Margaret's movements, whispering among themselves. The story was spreading quickly. This elderly woman had trained with a legendary coach whose name many recognized but few could claim any connection to. During the next drilling session, Jason deliberately positioned himself and his partner near Margaret and Lisa. His techniques became increasingly showy, with unnecessary flourishes and extra force. It was a display clearly meant to draw attention. "Hey Lisa," Jason called out during a brief pause. "Why don't you work with me for a bit?" I can show you the competition version of that escape. Lisa glanced at Margaret, then back to Jason. I'm good, thanks. I'm learning a lot here. Jason's jaw tightened. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time. No offense, ma'am, but there's a pretty big difference between how things were done in the Stone Age and modern jiu-jitsu techniques. The room grew quiet. Everyone sensed the challenge in his words. Margaret met his gaze calmly. Principles remain consistent even as applications evolve. The physics of leverage hasn't changed. Physics, huh? Jason's tone was dismissive. I'm more interested in what works in actual competition. When was the last time you competed? The 1900s. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the group. Coach Williams frowned and took a step forward. But Margaret spoke first. I've never been particularly interested in competition, she said. My training had different applications. Right, Jason said with a smirk. Let me guess, too deadly for the sport? That's what people always say when they can't back up their talk. Coach Williams intervened. That's enough, Jason. Show some respect. I'm just saying, Jason continued, undeterred. It's easy to talk about training with some famous coach from 1,000,000 years ago. It's another thing to prove your skills on the mat. No offense intended, he added with a smile that suggested the opposite. A tense silence fell over the room. Every eye moved between Jason and Margaret, waiting to see how the elderly woman would respond to the challenge. Margaret considered the young man thoughtfully. There was insecurity behind his bravado, the need to prove himself that often came with newly achieved rank. She had seen it countless times before in dojos and training centers across the world. Sometimes the only effective teacher was experience. Perhaps a demonstration would be helpful, she suggested quietly. For educational purposes. Jason's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with satisfaction. I think that's a great idea. Coach Williams, what do you think? A friendly demonstration match? Technique against technique? The coach looked concerned. I'm not sure that's appropriate given the age difference and... I don't mind, Margaret interrupted gently. If Jason is comfortable with it, Jason smiled confidently. Absolutely. I'll be careful, he added, the condescension clear in his tone. Coach Williams looked between them, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly. If you're both certain, we'll set up a controlled demonstration match. 2 minutes maximum. Light technical sparring only. No submissions, no competition intensity. Strictly educational. Of course, Jason agreed immediately, though the gleam in his eye suggested other intentions. That's acceptable, Margaret said with a small nod. The word spread quickly. Students who had been drilling in other areas of the room gathered around the main mat. Someone even went to the locker room to call in people who were changing. Within minutes, nearly 20 people had assembled to watch, including a few who weren't even part of the current class. Coach Williams cleared a large space in the center of the mat, establishing boundaries for the demonstration. Remember, this is technical only, he reiterated, looking pointedly at Jason. I'll stop it immediately if either of you escalates. Jason was bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet, rolling his shoulders and neck as he prepared. He looked like a boxer about to enter the ring, full of nervous energy and bravado. In contrast, Margaret stood quietly, her breathing calm and measured. She removed her glasses, folding them carefully before handing them to Lisa for safekeeping. Then she tightened her belt with practiced movements, each adjustment deliberate and unhurried. Should we record this? Someone whispered loudly. Nobody's going to believe it otherwise. Several phones appeared, held by students eager to capture what they anticipated would be either an embarrassing failure or a shocking upset. Jason and Margaret took their positions in the center of the mat, facing each other. The difference between them couldn't have been more stark. Youth versus age. Muscular power versus weathered experience. Modern training versus traditional foundation. Bow to each other, Coach Williams instructed. Jason gave a quick, perfunctory bow, barely taking his eyes off Margaret. His bow was more show than substance, lacking the genuine respect the gesture was meant to convey. Margaret's bow was deeper, more formal, the proper movement she had learned decades ago in a small dojo in Osaka. When she straightened, her eyes held no anger, no competitive fire, only calm attention. Coach Williams looked between them one last time. This is a technical demonstration only, he reminded everyone. The goal is to show movement and technique, not to win or dominate. Jason nodded impatiently, clearly eager to begin. Margaret simply waited, Her hands loose at her sides, her posture balanced and centered. The room had fallen completely silent. Even breathing seemed suspended as everyone watched with rapt attention. The only movement came from the phones being positioned for better recording angles. Coach Williams raised his hand, then dropped it decisively. "Begin." The moment Coach Williams signaled the start, Jason shot forward with practiced precision. His movement was fluid and aggressive, a textbook double-leg takedown attempt designed to establish immediate dominance. His technique wasn't sloppy or rushed. This was the practiced attack of someone with years of training. Under normal circumstances, against most opponents, it would have been effective. But Margaret Chen was not a normal opponent. As Jason's hands reached for her legs, Margaret shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. It was a subtle movement, a simple adjustment of her center of gravity that most observers wouldn't even notice. This slight change altered the space Jason was attacking, making him overcommit by mere inches, a small error that most wouldn't have been able to capitalize on. What happened next occurred so quickly that many watching would later need to review the phone recordings in slow motion to fully understand it. As Jason's momentum carried him slightly past his intended target, Margaret's left hand secured a perfect grip on his extended right arm. Simultaneously, her right hand found his collar. Using his forward motion against him, she pivoted her hip beneath his center of gravity and executed a textbook hip throw, what Japanese practitioners would call o-goshi. The movement was so smooth, so perfectly timed that it seemed almost gentle. Jason's feet left the ground as his body rotated through the air, guided by Margaret's precise control. He landed flat on his back, the impact forcing the air from his lungs with an audible whoosh. Before he could even register what had happened, Margaret maintained her grip on his arm, transitioning seamlessly into a wrist lock. The pressure was applied with surgical precision, not enough to cause injury, but positioned exactly at the point of mechanical disadvantage. Jason's face contorted in surprise and discomfort as he felt the lock engage. The entire sequence, from Coach Williams's starting signal to Jason tapping frantically against the mat, had taken exactly 10 seconds. The room fell into stunned silence. Coach Williams stared, his stopwatch forgotten in his hand. Lisa's mouth hung open in astonishment. Even Margaret seemed momentarily surprised by the speed of the resolution, though her face quickly returned to its usual calm composure. As she released the wrist lock and helped Jason to his feet, the room remained eerily quiet. Jason stood unsteadily, his face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning respect. He looked at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. What was that?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. "Basic principles," Margaret replied quietly. "Timing, balance, leverage." Coach Williams cleared his throat, finding his voice. "That was exceptional. I've never seen that transition executed so efficiently." The spell of silence broke as everyone began speaking at once. Excited chatter filled the room, students replaying what they'd just witnessed, phones being passed around to review the video footage. "Did you see how she used his momentum? I didn't even see the grip switch. That wrist lock was so fast." Jason stood in the center of it all, still processing what had happened. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a humbled thoughtfulness. He bowed deeply to Margaret, a genuine bow this time, full of newfound respect. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I would be honored to learn from you if you're willing to teach." Margaret returned his bow. "The best lessons often come from unexpected places. You have good technique, Jason. With time, you'll develop the patience to match it." The commotion attracted the attention of the front desk staff and students in the changing rooms. People crowded the entrance to the training area, asking what had happened. The story spread rapidly, growing with each retelling, though the reality was impressive enough without embellishment. Coach Williams approached Margaret, shaking his head in amazement. "Ms. Chen, I believe I owe you an apology for the reception you've received here. Clearly, we have much we could learn from you." Margaret smiled slightly. "No apology necessary, Coach. First impressions go both ways. Would you—" He hesitated, then continued. "Would you consider teaching a guest seminar here? Nothing formal, just sharing some of your knowledge with our students. I think there would be tremendous interest, especially after today." Margaret considered the request. Teaching wasn't something she had planned to resume in retirement, but there was something appealing about the idea of sharing her knowledge with genuinely interested students. Perhaps it was time to pass on a few more lessons before her days on the mat were done. "I might be persuaded," she replied, "though I warn you, I'm rather old-fashioned in my teaching methods." "After what we just saw, I don't think anyone would complain," Coach Williams said with a laugh. By now, Jason had recovered enough to join the conversation. "I've never been countered like that," he admitted. "It felt like I was moving in slow motion while you were 3 steps ahead." "That comes with time," Margaret assured him. "When you've seen the same attacks for 50 years, you develop a certain anticipation." 50 years? Jason's eyes widened. "You've been training for 50 years? "More or less," Margaret nodded, "though there's always something new to learn." As the initial excitement began to settle, the regular class resumed with a noticeably different atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided Margaret now sought her out, asking questions or simply watching her movements with newfound respect. Tom and Paul, hearing about what had happened from urgent text messages, arrived breathless from the changing room, having rushed to make the end of class just to confirm the unbelievable story. The remainder of the session took on the quality of an impromptu seminar, with Margaret occasionally offering quiet suggestions to nearby students. Her advice was never intrusive, always presented as a gentle option rather than a correction. Yet each small adjustment she suggested resulted in immediate improvement, evidence of her deep understanding of the fundamental principles. After class, a small group gathered around Margaret as she packed her bag, eager to hear more about her background. She shared a few carefully edited stories about her training in Japan, her brief competition career, and her subsequent decades of practice. She omitted the details of her military and security work, describing her career simply as international business consulting. "Will you be back tomorrow?" Lisa asked eagerly. "I plan to be," Margaret replied, "though I may need a day to recover," she added with a small smile, acknowledging her age without making it a limitation. As she prepared to leave, Jason approached her one last time. "Miss Chen, I wanted to apologize properly for my behavior. It was disrespectful and, well, just wrong." Margaret regarded him thoughtfully. "Humility and arrogance often live in the same house, Jason. The difference is which one you feed." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have talent. Now you have perspective to go with it. Use both wisely." By the time Margaret reached her car, the videos of her 10-second victory were already being shared across social media. Students had posted the footage to various martial arts forums and groups, where it was spreading rapidly among practitioners fascinated by the elderly woman's flawless technique. In her rearview mirror, Margaret could see several students still standing in the parking lot, watching her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. She smiled to herself as she drove away. Perhaps retirement wouldn't be quite as quiet as she had planned. That evening, as Margaret prepared a simple dinner in her kitchen, her phone buzzed repeatedly with notification after notification. Grace, her daughter, had sent a link to a video that was rapidly going viral, along with the message, "Mom, is this you? Since when do you do Jiu-Jitsu?" The video had already accumulated thousands of views and hundreds of comments. Most expressed amazement at the speed and precision of the technique. Many praised the elderly woman's skill and condemned the initial disrespect she had faced. Several black belts from other schools had weighed in, analyzing her perfect form and timing. The most common hashtag accompanying the shared video was simple but powerful: "Never judge." Margaret set her phone down without responding. There would be time for explanations later. For now, she simply enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of the day's events, after decades of working in the shadows of being underestimated and overlooked. There was a certain poetic justice in finally being seen, truly seen, for who she was and what she could do. The following week, Margaret taught her first official seminar at Elite Academy. The class was packed, with visitors from other local dojos who had seen the video and wanted to learn from her. Jason assisted as her uke, demonstrating a newfound humility that enhanced rather than diminished his obvious talent. Coach Williams had printed a special banner for the occasion. Guest Seminar, Traditional Judo Applications with Margaret Chen. Beneath her name, in smaller letters, were the words "Student of Master Takeshi Yamamoto." As Margaret looked out at the room full of attentive faces, young and old, Beginner and advanced, all united by a genuine desire to learn. She felt a familiar warmth in her chest. This wasn't the high-stakes world of her former career with its secrecy and danger. This was something simpler, purer, the transmission of knowledge that had been passed to her half a century earlier. The first principle, she began, her voice clear and confident, is to understand that age, size, and strength are merely factors, not limitations. True mastery comes from working with what you have, not wishing for what you don't. Throughout the room, students nodded, many filming or taking notes. In the back, Jason watched with newfound respect in his eyes. His previous arrogance transformed into genuine appreciation. Some lessons couldn't be taught with words alone. Sometimes 10 seconds on the mat could change perspectives that years of talking never could. And sometimes, Margaret reflected as she began her demonstration, the most powerful technique of all was simply showing up, day after day, refusing to be defined by others' expectations. That was a lesson worth sharing, on or off the mat.